We were transported by train from the base in Tampa, Florida, I think it was McGill Air Force Base, to a base in New Jersey. From New Jersey by bus to the pier in Manhattan, where we boarded the Queen Elizabeth. On the Queen Elizabeth, we were told that each of us was one of 25,000 military personnel, that this represented the greatest target that the Nazi submarines and Air Force could possibly have. It was their feeling that if they could sink this ship with its 25,000 soldiers, the U.S. would just leave the war. That would leave England easy prey, and the Nazis could go on to conquer the world. And so that every submarine possible directed towards the path of the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary when it sailed. Whenever we got close to the shore, they sent out air patrols to try to find it. We knew that we could show no lights. We could throw nothing overboard. We could not write home about anything that had transpired up to that point. In our writing, we could never mention the name of the ship or anything about it. And we later learned that there really was very little chance of our ship being intercepted. For one thing, because of its great speed, no submarine could hope to catch up to it. If they were not in its path, they were harmless. Our quarters aboard were very fortunate. There was a little compartment directly above the stern of the ship. Now, in the stern were these vast propellers, or screws as they're known to the Navy, and they thrashed and rumbled and sounded like cannons going off with every turn of the screws. And we were in a metal compartment just above them, separated by only feet, with no soundproofing. It was just the steel structure of the ship itself. Fortunately, we didn't have beds, we had hammocks. And a hammock is the best way to travel on difficult seas, because instead of sticking with the ship in its wild gyrations, gravity kept it more or less stationary as the ship moved around it. So I was delighted to sleep in a hammock. But no sooner was that assigned to me than I was called up to an officer's quarters, and I was told to get my rifle and go to the head of the stairway leading to our compartment and guard against any niggers coming down. This is harsh, but that was the way it was at that time. As part of our sleeping compartment, we also had a head, in naval terms, a toilet. And there were blacks stationed on the deck just above us. And they would come down the steps and use our head. And I don't know if it was just the officer who complained or some of the men in my outfit who were Southerners, who were approved of segregation, who were horrified at the thought of sharing a toilet with a black man. And so I was delegated I was put on guard at the head of the stairs to keep any black man from descending. Well, I sat there for a matter of a few minutes, and I said, this can't be. In the first place, I'd been brought up in an absolutely liberal household. In fact, we lived at the juncture of an Italian section, a Jewish section, and a Negro section. And so I had friends in all of them and learned to respect them all and to work well with any of them. Here I was assigned to something that I considered morally objectionable and militarily highly undesirable. These were soldiers just as we were, and nobody knew what duties they would be assigned. And so I just walked away. Well, I immediately, almost immediately, got a call up to our commander's stateroom, and he said, "What'd you do?" I said, "Well, I left this seat assigned to me by lieutenant. Name is irrelevant. In any event, he said, "What did you do? You were told to sit there." And I said, "Well," and this lieutenant is threatening to have you court-martialed. And he says that in times of war, if you leave your post, you can be shot. And I laughed. I said, "Well, Captain, let's look at this." He said I was to guard duty. Now, we know that that's illegal. You cannot assign a military duty as punishment. And that was certainly punishment for me. Furthermore, although the Army certainly practiced segregation and certainly did not highly respect most of its black members, there was no official approval of such conduct. And that if this matter ever got to a court-martial, that lieutenant would be very embarrassed by the fact that he had ordered someone to keep fellow soldiers out of the head. And I said, if anything happens, he's going to be subject to a court-martial for what he has done. And I said, if you support it, I'd be afraid that you too will be subjected to the same problems. So he said, "Well, all right, go on about your duties. I don't want you in any more trouble." So I spent the rest of the 5 days aboard the ship like anybody else. The whole incident about keeping blacks out of our toilet reminded me of the way I felt first time I went to Washington. After I'd enlisted in the Marines, I was sent to Quantico, Virginia for the officers' training. Took a train from New York, changed at Washington for a train to Quantico. In Washington, I saw signs all over. And the water fountains was whites only. Some of the toilets, it said whites only, and others it said blacks only. And I couldn't believe this. I knew about segregation in the South. And I knew that many Southerners still thought they should have won the Civil War and still resented Negroes in any way, shape, or form. But I couldn't believe that in our nation's capital, where all these wonderful high-flown phrases came from, we're all equal, everyone alike. It was absolutely untrue, and it began right there in Washington. But that was a blow. And from then on, I never found anything to dispel the bad feelings that I had of that association. It wasn't until a while after, till we'd seen a lot of service on the continent, that I learned just how valuable these black soldiers were to us. They ran what was called the Red Ball Express. As we followed Patton across Europe, gasoline supplies became very, very scarce. And the further you went, the more difficult it was to supply the tanks with fuel. In order to help correct the situation, everybody who was not necessary in the tank attack was ordered to halt all mechanized units so as not to waste gasoline. And our unit, with its mobile radar, was considered less valuable than Patton's advances. And so we were ordered to stop in our tracks, and we did. And while we were at this location, which was a little town in Geary in Verson, while we were stopped there, we saw endless streams of 2.5-ton trucks passing by. It was the Red Ball Express. Their black drivers worked day and night. They didn't stop. They would complete one run and start another. And they brought endless jerry tanks, as they were called, 5-gallon tanks of gasoline up to the very point of the advance. It wasn't until I knew about that, of course, during the war, as it was happening. But it wasn't until after the war that I learned about the Tuskegee Airmen. This was a group of black pilots who, against the advice of almost everyone involved, were enrolled as pilots in the Air Force. They all became fighter pilots, and their mission was to accompany American bombers as they flew to Germany to prevent them from being shot down by Luftwaffe pilots. And they performed that duty magnificently. There are records of their having convoyed hundreds of bombers, which on raids without them suffered severe losses. They're reputed never to have lost a bomber that they were protecting. So their courage, their abilities, their will were well known or kept secret until long after the war. Now it's common knowledge, and further reason why I feel so justified in having taken the positions I did. The trip on the Queen Elizabeth took 5 days, which was the normal time for the few luxury ships that could do it. On ship, the mood was very mixed. There were some people who missed no opportunity to pray. There were others who bit their nails and were obviously agitated. And a group who felt, well, it is what it is. We don't know what we're going to be met with. In the meantime, let's not be too aggravated. I think I was one of that group. And I spent most of the trip reading in front of the main mast. And as the ship veered from side to side, I could look up and see the top of the mast doing the same. But as long as I concentrated on the book, the motion was almost unnoticeable. So I read my way across. Certainly, we all knew that there was going to be an invasion of the continent, of France specifically.
How did you know that?
We knew about it because Russia had been militating for it very publicly for more than a year, because it was commonly discussed. It was known that this was an absolutely necessary objective before we could hope to meet the Nazi forces on anything like an equal footage. Since it was logically, militaristically speaking, the only possibility, we knew that's where we were going. It would have been a total surprise had we landed in Africa or any other place. And the entire Pacific was ruled out because there's no question but that we were heading east. East lay England.